On a blustery February day in southern France, a group gathers in this cemetery. They are here not to grieve for a recently departed loved one, but to mourn the loss of the former French colony of Algeria, and to remember those who resorted to violence to keep it French. That bloody 8-year struggle failed, and in 1962, Algeria gained independence from France. But more than 4 decades on, La Guerre sans nom, or the War Without a Name, as it's been known here, still evokes complex feelings. Not least for the 1.5 million French veterans who fought in it. Some feel shame and regret, others bitterness and anger.
J'ai perdu une partie de ma vie, et quand j'ai perdu ma mère,
I lost a part of my life. I lost my mother. I lost everything, everything. And today, I look at the French people and see that they have no answers to those of us who have suffered.
Algeria, Africa's second largest country, was colonized by the French in the 19th century. But unlike the neighboring French protectorates of Tunisia or Morocco, Algeria was considered French territory, legally a mere extension of mainland France itself. And by the mid-20th century, it was home to over 1 million European settlers. While they enjoyed the privileges of French citizenship, the overwhelming majority of the population, Arab and Berber Muslims, reaped few benefits from the French presence.
The majority of the native population didn't have the same rights as those held by a French citizen. There was a contradiction between those supposedly egalitarian republican principles that France was supposed to be importing to Algeria as a colony and the reality.
In 1954, a group of Algerians determined to end France's colonial rule and achieve independence turned to violence. On November the 1st, the recently formed FLN, or National Liberation Front, launched attacks across Algeria against French military and civilian targets. For the French authorities in Paris, the FLN's aim of independence for Algeria was unthinkable. Troops were sent in to clamp down on what was regarded as mere civil unrest. And even as the violent rebellion escalated in the coming months into an all-out conflict, France refused to admit it was entering into war.
War can only take place when two clearly distinct national groups are concerned. Calling it a war meant admitting that Algeria wasn't France.
Algeria may have been considered part of France, but for those on the mainland, the violence engulfing it often seemed distant.
I wasn't really interested in what was happening in Algeria. I was mainly bound up with myself, sport, friends. I had a completely ordinary life.
But Jean-Pierre's life was soon to be touched by events across the Mediterranean Sea.
Every Frenchman had to carry out military service. We owed it to the state. If we didn't, we were considered traitors, cowards. So one day, I received an official letter calling me up, and I went, just like that, without asking myself too many questions.
But on arriving in Algeria, uncomfortable questions about the French mission were difficult to suppress.
On one side were the few Europeans living in the region that had a lot of money. On the other was the Algerian population, which had almost nothing. This meant that I started asking myself questions concerning their reasons for rebelling, wondering whether their action was in fact justified.
Many young soldiers sent to Algeria were deployed to villages in the countryside to root out FLN influence at any cost.
2 or 3 other soldiers and I found ourselves face to face with 2 FLN fighters. Guns were fired on either side, and they were wounded. I stopped shooting to wait for reinforcements. Then other soldiers arrived, and one simply killed one of the FLN fighters. I'll never forget that. It remains an open wound.
Other veterans too remain traumatized by the scenes they witnessed as young conscripts.
To this day, I still dream of disgusting scenes. For example, at the end of an operation, we'd captured some prisoners. They weren't dead, but we had to do something with them. I have in my mind, it's not voluntary, the image of our special forces just gawking at them with disgust, and then going to have a beer. Then some Harkis were paid to come along and cut the prisoners' throats with kitchen knives.
The word Harki has come to have the derogatory connotation traitor, but it originally referred to the Muslim Algerian forces that were recruited by the French to fight against the independence movement. Abdelkader Hamoumou was one. He says he joined the French after the FLN tried to kill his father, and claims that neither side had a monopoly on savagery.
I once saw an old woman, and I was sure the FLN would kill her because she had insulted them. A few days later, I went with my mother to collect feed for our animals, and I found a piece of flesh. I showed it to my mother, and she told me it was a piece of the old woman's skin.
Despite an increasing number of troops and tactics which included the forced resettlement of large swathes of the population, the French proved unable to crush the independence movement. And at the end of 1956, the FLN hardened its stance, launching a campaign of urban attacks, which inaugurated a new chapter in the war, to be known as the Battle of Algiers.
Bombs were planted in student bars in which there were young Algerians, not just French people. And an exploded bomb means people wounded, killed, blood, fear.
Such bombings were often carried out by Algerian women dressed in Western clothes, a tactic which sent the European settler population into hysteria. France reacted harshly, deploying its 10th Parachute Division, headed by General Jacques Massou, to Algiers in an attempt to prevent any further attacks and stop a general strike called by the FLN to garner international attention to the independence cause. General Paul Aussares reported directly to General Massou.
We heard that the independence movements of Algeria, they would organize a strike. The governor and General Massou agreed that we would stop that strike at any price. You understand, at any price.
That price included degrading forms of torture practiced by General Massou's Parachute Division as they swept the streets of Algiers' ancient Muslim quarter, the Kasbah, in an attempt to identify and break FLN cells.
I gave orders to get any possible information. So some of the people in charge used torture. I knew they had partial torture, yes, I knew. But I found it was better to have some results, even by torture.
General Aussares insists that the coercive methods of interrogation, including torture, were sanctioned at the highest levels of the French state.
Every night I made a report of what I had done, and I did not hide anything. Every morning I gave the copy of what I had done to General Massou, and the same day that copy was sent to the government without changing a word.
Many were appalled at the measures that France, the country of liberty, equality and fraternity, was undertaking within its own territory.
Aujourd'hui, les autorités françaises reconnaissent qu'il y avait la guerre.
Today, the French authorities admit that a war took place. At the time, they refused to. So these prisoners didn't fall under the Geneva Convention. What's more, they weren't even entitled to the same rights as ordinary citizens. Basically, they were outside the law.
Monsieur Vergès is today one of France's most controversial lawyers, famous for his defense of international criminals, such as Carlos the Jackal. But he began his career defending FLN suspects, an action undertaken, he claims, to raise attention in France itself to the systematic abuse of human rights being carried out in its name.
Parce que l'Algérie était le lieu de crimes affreux.
Appalling crimes were committed in Algeria that no one knew about. Events were hushed up. Court cases were the only way of denouncing these crimes publicly, the only way of denouncing torture.
Through an unrelenting show of force and the widespread torture of FLN suspects, the French eventually claimed victory in the Battle of Algiers. Attacks declined and the streets of the capital became safe once again for Europeans. But just as the army was claiming military success, politically the tide was turning. For as news spread of the heavy-handed measures being employed by France, opinion began to shift towards the independence movement, both internationally and even among some in France itself.
I did my best to let people know what was happening in the Algerian war by writing articles about my experiences as a soldier. And this contributed to the protests against torture that were gaining currency in France.
In 1958, a constitutional crisis erupted.
A military junta seizes control in Algiers.
As generals in Algiers launched a military coup, determined to return to power General Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle had been the leader of the French resistance to the Nazi occupation in World War II. His supporters among the army and the European settlers of Algeria now calculated that only he would have the mettle to preserve French rule in Algeria. But they were to be bitterly disappointed. On July the 5th, 1962, and after 132 years of French colonial rule, Algeria was declared an independent nation. The joy of its people was hard to contain. For the path to independence had been a bloody 8-year war that had led to the loss of up to 1 million Algerian lives. That war was prolonged by a breakaway group of hardliners known as the Organization of the Secret Army, or the OAS, which brought France itself to the verge of civil war in its attempt to keep Algeria French at all costs.
C'était une vraie menace. C'était une vraie bataille.
The OAS was a major threat. It wasn't a sideshow. This was a war within a war. And indeed, de Gaulle was almost killed several times in direct attacks.
The activities of the OAS against both French and Algerian targets accentuated the intercommunal tensions in Algeria, which boiled over as independence grew near, endangering the future of the European settlers.
Alors personnellement, c'est mon père qui m'a poussé à quitter l'Algérie.
One day I was on the building site where I worked. 2 Algerians came asking for a job. I told them there wasn't any work and to try somewhere else. I went into the office and one of them closed the door. He was 2 meters away holding a gun, telling me not to move. I went at him and we fought. He didn't fire, but I got beaten around the head. It was